And then the first thing we'll do is ask for nominations for the chairing of the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this joint meeting of Adults and Children and Young People Select Committee at Monmouthshire County Council. As this is a joint meeting, the first item of business is to elect a chair. Can I have nominations, please?
Could I propose Councillor Tudor Thomas?
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Thomas is elected as chair of the meeting. And Councillor, nominations for a vice chair? Well, automatically, I guess, becomes Councillor Taylor.
Councillor Francis Taylor.
And a seconder?
I'll second it, yeah.
Thank you very much. Would you like to join me?
Well, good morning, Bore da croeso. Good morning and welcome to this joint select committee between children and young people and the adult select. I think the first thing I'd like to do is for us just to run around so for the benefit of the public so that everybody knows who we are. I think most people have got their nameplates there as well. I'm Tudor Thomas. I'm Chair of Children and Young People.
Francis Taylor, Chair of Adult Select.
Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance, and here today as your scrutiny support function.
Eve Parkinson, Head of Adult Services.
Good morning, Julie Boothroyd, Chief Officer for Social Care, Safeguarding and Health.
Hello, I'm Sophie Cook. I'm in the transformation team.
I'm Jane Rogers, Head of Children's Services.
Hi, I'm Penny Jones and I'm Cabinet Member for Social Services, Safeguarding and Health.
I'm Maggie Harris and I'm here from MASC.
Councillor Roger Harris, Crescendon Ward and member of the Adult Select Committee.
Bore da, good morning. David Jones, Councillor for the Criconi Ward and a member of this committee.
Good morning, I'm Martin Grokerd. I'm the elected member for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny and I'm a member of both the Children and Young People and Adults standing committees.
Good morning everyone. I'm County Councillor Ruth Edwards, elected member for Lentilio Cresceni, and I am a member of the Adult Select Committee. Thank you.
Good morning, Richard Jones, Performance Manager.
Good morning, Councillor Louise Brown. I'm a member of both committees and I'm an elected member for Shire Newton Ward. Thank you.
Good morning, Malcolm Lane, a member for the Mardy Ward and a member of the Children and Young People's Committee.
Good morning, Councillor Peter Clark, member for Langibby.
Morning, Councillor Sheila Woodhouse from Grovefield Ward in Abergavenny and member of the Adult Select Committee.
Good morning, Councillor Jo Watkins, Councillor for Caldecott Castle Ward and member of CYP.
Morning, I'm County Councillor Tony Easton, member of Justo Ward Caldecott. I'm not a member of either committee, but I am visiting you this morning.
Morning, Claire Robbins. I'm the Transformation Service Manager for Social Care and Health.
Okay, could you switch your mic off, please? Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move to apologies for absence. Ms. Brown?
Yeah, I think Councillor Paul Pavia might be able to, he's apologising for coming a bit later to this meeting. He's hoping to be here later if possible.
Okay.
If not, apologies. Thank you.
Chair, I've got the list in front of me, and the only official one on here is Councillor Maureen Powell.
Laura Jones, Councillor Laura Jones.
I've also been given now Matt Feekins as well.
Sorry,
Okay, thanks. Declarations of interest. Any declarations at the start, or obviously as they arise, if you sort of signal so that we can make note of that, we'll take them as they come if people are happy with that. Okay. We're going to switch the agenda slightly because some of the people involved this morning have other commitments that they've got to get to. So we're going to move up the Chief Officer Social Care, Safeguarding and Health Annual Report first, and then secondly we'll do the corporate plan. I would ask, because obviously I don't want to in any way cut down on time today because both reports are incredibly important to both committees, but I would ask that the presentation really doesn't go much more above sort of 15 minutes. And in reality, I think most people, certainly in talking in the pre-meeting, we want really a synopsis and if you like, the highlights. It's a little bit like a football programme, but we want the highlights and then obviously discussion and to end up then with some thoughts and recommendations, obviously questions at the end. So I'll hand over now to Chief Officer, to give the report. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair. We're going to put the report up so that we can refer to it. But first of all, I just wanted, by way of introduction, to explain why we have used a very different approach this year. The whole purpose behind the Social Services Department is very much about supporting people in Monmouthshire. And one of the challenges that certainly I have and the team have is making connection with people and making sure that people who use our services are able to influence, shape and be part of decision making. So we took a very different approach this year to what is a statutory responsibility. Each director across 22 authorities has to produce a report. Given that I wanted to make sure that this was as inclusive as possible and actually gathered evidence from the front line and from every part of the social services agenda, we started very early this year connecting with our workforce. And particularly when we get onto the section of the report that I'm going to probably focus most on, is the quality standards section, which is the place where we have to demonstrate evidence of progress. So the challenge, if you like, the ask for the workforce was, can you give us examples of where we are meeting those quality standards and real life example, ideally from the people that are receiving support from us, but also our analysis of that. And I have to say, I've been very, very pleased with that response. And I think it marks a very, very different shift around ownership of the annual report. So I could have locked myself in a room and written, a thesis, which is in effect what it would have been. Instead, we've taken a very different approach. I think it's worth pointing out that the way that the report is set out is a template across the 22 authorities, so I don't really have much room for manoeuvre around that. So the whole format of the report is carried out in that way. What I'm going to do, Sophie's just going to scroll through. I think we gave members, I'm fairly sure that we gave you a bit of a crib sheet. I think one of the things that I would want to say is that the area of work that I'm responsible for is very broad, is very far-reaching and goes very deep. And actually collecting all of the evidence into a short report is actually quite difficult to do. And actually we're seeing this as an opportunity, a platform to build on really, and actually be able to put more evidence into this sort of format as we move forward. I'm just going to go to the chapters. Can we just have a quick look at the chapter section? That's it. Yeah. So in terms of the way in which this report is laid out, we have my summary, which is my analysis of what has happened in the last 12 months, the good, the bad and the ugly, as I call it. And obviously we have each of the sections around children's and adults. So Eve and Jane and her teams have very much been putting forward what's the vision, where are we going, how far have we got in that section. As I mentioned earlier, how people are shaping our services is a fundamental ask of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. And so it's very important that we're able to demonstrate how are people involved in shaping what we do. And I think there's some really interesting evidence in that section, which I will touch on in a second. And then promoting and improving the well-being of those people that we're here to help is the big meaty section, as I call it, which is where our evidence of performance is and where our evidence from people sits. And then finally, how we do what we do. So that's very much about the mechanics of, you know, the money, the people, how we support our workforce to make sure that we're supporting people in Monmouthshire, and then a summary section. So what I propose to do is I'd quite like to just have a look at how people are shaping our services, if that's okay. The summary speaks for itself. I'm hoping that you've been able to navigate around. There's a lot of detail in this report, but it's been delivered in a way that hopefully is accessible, because the one primary focus for me is that people out there, so people who use our services, are able to navigate and understand this information. So once we've been through the cycle of scrutiny, and once this report has been to Council, we would want this to be fully accessible through the website, and also in many other ways that we can use this over the coming period of time. So how are people shaping our services? I think this is a fundamental area that we need to improve on, but also be able to demonstrate how far we have developed. And I think what you can see on the left-hand side, which is an image, very much drawn up from the service perspective, trying to capture in day-to-day language, if you like, and in some simplicity, what some of our core responsibilities are, particularly around our corporate parenting responsibilities and supporting looked after children. Let me just go down a bit. So there's a couple of images there. And then as we move further on, we've given you some examples of where for example, children with disabilities recently have been looking at how they deliver the services to very vulnerable children that we're supporting, and have taken a very, very different approach to this. So in the past, we might have said, we need to modernise the service, we're going to speak to the service provider, and we're going to change how we deliver that service. What happened this time is parents and the young people themselves were very central to the shaping and development of this new service. And I think that marks a real change. The work around My Mates, members will be familiar with this, because I think it has actually featured in Council as well. But again, is another example how, you know, in the past, members will have heard me say this as well, that, you know, we used to run services that perhaps were a bit more warehousey, as in we provided, you know, fairly fundamental support for people in a centre, and it was often not necessarily meeting people's needs. The My Mates example of how people are shaping our services, I think is a really good example, and is now actually being widened across the Gwent area, because actually we've put people in charge, if you like, of their lives, and actually we're supporting people to have a very different outcome. And then finally, Monmouthshire Meals again, which is one of our, you know, very important services. That service themselves have initiated a very interesting piece of work this year, where they've surveyed the people that they support to really understand what are the factors around isolation and loneliness, because they were picking up themselves that actually people were needing more than just somebody popping in with a meal. And actually it's an ongoing piece of work, so it's only just started. But again, I think it's demonstrating how we are trying to help by partnering people and shaping how services will look for the future. And I think it is a different approach. So onto the big section, which you know, has a lot of the information performance-wise connected in it. You will see that each of the quality standards is split into a children's and adults agenda, because that's how we collect our performance information. But it gives you some of the headline performance information that we bring through scrutiny anyway, but it puts it in one place. And then some analysis of that information, and then some examples. So I'm hoping that members have had a chance to look at some of the actual stories. So here we've got Mary's story and Ellis's story, which give some evidence to sort of, if you like, bring the performance data to life. So we can just have the figures, but actually the people's story helps demonstrate how we're moving forward. So that's the largest section, and then obviously we've got the summary section at the end. So I could go on probably all day, if I'm honest, which I'm not going to do. I'm hoping that you've had a chance to dig in. I think it's fair to say that this isn't it isn't something that's going to sit on the shelf, you know, box tick, we've done the annual report. It's something that's going to sort of lead and carry on and actually be built on as we move forward. I've asked Sophie to come today because one of the other options that we've got, this product is just a Microsoft product called Sway. We were all going to just do a little bit of a sway to illustrate the point, but one of the things that's really good about the functionality of this is I'm working on the basis that you've all got a smartphone. No, Ruth. How many people have got smartphones? Some have. Yeah, lovely. So if you've got a smartphone and you would like this on your smartphone, it's really, really easy to read, and you can flick through it. And I think, you know, if you were out and about, for example, in your communities and people were wanting some information that actually is stored in here, you could quite quickly just click on it. So if anybody wants that functionality, it's a 2-minute job. Penny's just put it on hers. I've got it on mine. It's to create that sort of more accessible approach to something that's more live and lives rather than perhaps is just a report that we put in the cupboard and it gets dusty. So very happy to answer any of the questions that you have. And obviously I've got Eve and Jane as the heads of those services as well to contribute. So I hope that's okay, Judah? Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Julie, for that report. And obviously, you've highlighted things for us. It's quite a comprehensive report. It's quite obviously a lengthy report. We move now to questions and observations. And I said at the pre-meeting, I would ask, in terms of questions, that we don't have more than 1 or 2 questions at a time. I think it's very difficult for senior officers at the front to be able to manage that, and as well that we don't have a long introduction to it, sort of diatribe before we actually get to the question. It is questions and brief observations. So I open it now to members of both committees. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Julie, did you say this is the format that all 22 authorities have to work on and report this way? Did I get that? Did I get that right?
In the format,
yeah.
Not the fact that we do it in a sway. So the headings, all the headings.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, all the headings and the template for the chapters. That's all the same.
Right. Another question is, that's this year. How are you going to, what will happen next year? For example, there's vast amounts in here. How will we know next year what the differences are, if there are any, which there must be? So I'm just interested in that one, and then I'll come back.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we do it again next year, unless the template changes, and there has been some talk about perhaps changing the template. But in a sense, this is we have performance every year, so we bring reports into Select every year around these performance metrics, if you like. I think what we've done in addition to that is actually put more meat around that. So I could have come in with some very, well, I couldn't have made it brief actually, but we could have given you the performance information and said this is where we are this year. We have targets that are set and reset every year. So next year we could actually say this is, you know, we can actually refer back to how we've delivered against that. But it's more than the targets, I think. I don't like the word targets, but it's more than that. It's much more about the impact for people. So those stories and the measures will still be there, but it will be a roll-on roll. It has been every year.
Just coming back then, they were, if you like, lead-ins. I think it's a fascinating format. There's vast amounts of information in here, which obviously we can use if anyone out there in our wards is interested in. But I just wonder, because you've already stated that it is very difficult to summarise this, but really I would like to see a summary report actually for us, if you know what I mean, alongside, so we can scrutinise the bits that you think you've done very well and the bits we hope that you tell us that you aren't doing very well and you need our help with, etc. And I just wonder if there could be a truncated report for us to look at. So, as I say, there's vast amounts in here, and none of us have looked at all of it. So, would that be possible?
Short answer, no. Because actually, I think it requires reading. You know, we operate a very serious part of delivery in this council. And for me to do a truncated short version would not be doing justice, I don't believe, to... No. But I think to be fair, if you have read, or if you read my summary, which is at the beginning, I think that gives the flavour of what we've got to do statutorily. It also lays out the areas that I'm going to focus on. So, for example, in the children's and the adults world, I've only picked 3 or 4 areas to focus on. I haven't picked absolutely everything, and we've picked on areas that are demonstrating good progress, and some areas that we're concerned about. So I would argue that the first bit of the report, which is the director's summary, and then leading into the children and adults bit, which is probably only about 6 or 7 pages, that would be your summary. Now, the quality standards bit is where a lot more of the detail emerges, but if you just read that top bit, I think you'd be able to say that's the truncated version, potentially. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Councillor Jo Watkins.
Thank you. Visually, the report's very appealing to look at, and I haven't had a chance to click through all of the links, because when you click on something, it goes onto another page. So I haven't done all of that yet, but I'll try and do that in future weeks. My question is to Jane in relation to children's services, and it's the little paragraph in the beginning which says about looked after children. And the pressures across the whole system are evident. The numbers of looked after children are rising, pattern mirrored across Wales. And it says, whilst we develop interventions to address early identification, and work is underway to maximise the opportunities to reduce the current trends. Could you give a little bit of detail on what that work actually is, please? Could you give some detail on work is underway to maximise the opportunities to reduce the current trends?
Thank you. I can answer that. So we have some 2 main teams that are in early development. They're implemented but early development. The first of that is the Educare team. So the Educare team is to work with children and families who are heading towards a looked after response to their needs. And that team is made up of some very well-skilled support workers. There's a part-time psychologist that works in that team, a senior prac and a social worker. Statutory social workers refer children to that team where they feel that with some really focused intervention, they can affect a turnaround. We've got some new workers coming into the team so that we can expand it further. We have family mediation, specialist worker in family mediation joining us, and our family group conferencing service kind of links heavily into that team, and we've expanded that by 50% as well, so another worker essentially. The team operates very much in terms of trying to get a deep engagement with the family, so really working at levels of motivation, any barriers to family change that there might be, as well as really developing skills within the parenting environment and emotional understanding of their child from a developmental approach, principally based around attachment theory and trauma-informed working. So it's a heavily, intensively resourced team. So they can't work with lots and lots of families, but they work with families that are really identified that with that final push of a very kind of intensive and specialist service, we can work to keep that child within that family. It's a new team for us. It's an expanding team, as I've just described. Those posts have been recruited but are not yet fully in. So we hope over the next year to really see that come into full effect. We've already got some early indication that they do affect that turnaround. There are some children who are already on care orders but placed with family members. They're also kind of starting to pick up some work from within that kind of part of our business, so that in due course we can be looking back to the court to asking for those orders to be revoked. So it's quite an exciting development for us as a service. It's not something that we've been able to implement before in Monmouthshire. It is new territory for us, but we've done it carefully through real good research around the kind of evidence of what works. It's an integrated model that we deliver. We have the capacity where it's required to work with a step-down approach, but with families up to 18 months, because that is the level that it will take to get that turnaround and sustained change for families. So that's the first major development that we're working on. The second is a higher level again, and it's called our MIST team, and MIST is MYST, and it stands for My Support Team. It's working again with a very few children, but our most complex children. It tends to work with children who are either already in care, whose care arrangements may be at high risk of breaking down. And in some instances, it'll work with children who are in family arrangements but are really heading up towards either more specialist foster care or residential. So it's support workers, it's psychologists, it's therapeutic practitioners. So between those two kind of specialist services working with our most complex children, that's where we see us having the biggest impact on children who are at the kind of the more higher tier. And I suppose underneath that, you need all the services to kind of layer up. So we're expanding our building. We have expanded our Building Stronger Families team, and I know I've spoken with members before around, we've changed the emphasis of that team, so it's not just about coordinating other services, but actually they are the intervention in themselves. It's less intense. It's less, they're not there day in, day out, but they've got that kind of brokering in other support services, working directly with families to kind of support change, very much in terms of the family's own goal setting and direction. So it's got a different emphasis, a different feel to the more intense services, but it's very much part of our suite of services. It's no point us just putting in the high end stuff. We've got to be building at every tier. So those are some of the things that we're developing and implementing to try and just reverse the trend. I mean, it's always difficult when you talk about reversing trend, because of the children that we look after them because that's the response that they've needed. Of course, we always try and, wherever we can, help families to stay together safely. And even in our looked after population, many of those are placed with family. I hope that answers the question.
Councillor Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, and that's very informative, Jane, and I think it gives all us a hope that there's an awful lot of work going on in the background, a lot of people out there wouldn't be aware of. The one thing I wanted to ask was, yes, you're saying there's an increase in looked after children, and we've seen it gradually increasing over the years, even since I've been a member. Is it in a particular age group? Is it sort of young children that are increasing, or teenagers that we're seeing the increase, or is it sort of going along the board? Thank you.
It is across the board. Interestingly, we have had, we are looking after more 0 to 4 children now than we would have ever really expected to, because when the younger children come in, quite often you're kind of either seeing them rehabilitated or, you know, they're kind of coming out of the system. You don't want very young children to be in the system moving forward. One of the biggest increases we've had in terms of our looked after children population is, as I've just mentioned before, children who were placed with parents. So they're on care orders but are placed back at home with parents. That tends to be the younger age group. So we've developed within the service a kind of carved out a little pod of social workers and support workers that are really focusing on those kinship arrangements, as we call them. So children who are placed at home, because what you really want to be doing is if they're ending up at the end of court process back at home with a parent but on a full care order, you want to be able to relatively quickly really get them one way or the other. If they're going to live with their parents, well, let's get out of their lives as quickly as we can, as long as it's safe. So we're really kind of focused on those children at the moment. Similarly, children who are in foster care on full care orders but placed with aunties, uncles, grandma, granddad. Again, if that's a good, safe family arrangement, we don't want to stay in their lives. We want them out and on special guardianship orders and so forth. So we're really trying to, that's all the other things we're doing, really focus. We've got a small team that's kind of grouped together, cornered from our mainstream teams, just to focus on those kinship arrangements, just to see if we can get those kind of out of the system in a safe way. Or if not, then a proper plan for permanence.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm going to try and, I'm always accused of asking too many questions at once, so I'm going to try and simplify the questions that I ask. First of all, the accessibility of the document. Secondly, the reporting format, and then giving, thirdly, an example of how the reporting format makes scrutiny somewhat difficult. First of all, I want to say that, I think the report is very, I don't want to come across as, I want to say that the report is very positive in terms of the examples it gives. And the positive side is that it's a very general and easy to read document, which I think most people would find that they can follow. In terms of the sway system, I'm actually not very keen on it, because it does actually create some difficulties in scrutiny, because previously when there's been reports, it goes into the member system and you can highlight and you can put comments by the side before any meeting in terms of questions. Well, you can't really do this in relation to sway. There doesn't, unless I've missed it, there doesn't seem to be a facility to do that. And when I first opened it, the typeface was so minute I couldn't read it. And then I read the email about accessibility and pressing that button, and then it came to a normal size. And I just wonder how accessible it would be in terms of a smartphone. I've got an Android phone, and I'm not sure whether smartphone means that, because obviously iPhones are up to the high end of the equation in terms of phones. And I'm just thinking about your audience, because your audience is elderly, and obviously some of them don't necessarily have a computer, or some of them may find it easier just to click on a normal Word or PDF to actually read something than the sort of smart end of the technology. So my concern is in the new format, it is about accessibility and scrutiny and how it affects that. And I think it's very good in terms of the generalist format, but just narrowing it down to looking at 3.5 of this report, for example, it gives some figures about carers, and it says that 68% of carers feel supported to continue caring. Now, that's obviously, you know, the majority, which is very good, but my concern is that there's no indication of what about the 22% who aren't, and you know what's been. I mean, I know that we can't really reach. Sorry, not 22%, 32%. I got my calculation wrong there. Sorry. You know, we don't hear any description about them, and I know that you know, from speaking to people in the community, caring for somebody who has got problems can be a very, very hard road to follow, and basically you need a lot of support. You know, having said that, I'm very impressed by looking at Meals on Wheels and looking at loneliness and isolation. But again, it's a general description, and I appreciate it's a new review, but we don't get details about how that system is going to change. So I'm afraid I'm a bit of a facts and figures sort of person, and I like tables, and I like showing how are we doing in comparison with other local authorities, how are we doing in comparison with the year before, and because we're just getting statistics to do with this year, we don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown.
No, it's fine. Okay, I've made a note of the areas.
I've tried to split it up into three. I hope that's understandable.
So,
Thank you.
I'm going to start with accessibility. Let's be fair, I knew this was going to be a risk. As in, anything new is a challenge. Having said that, I'm working on the principle that we are a digitally led authority, and that we all have laptops, we all have access to those things. Microsoft Sway, I don't want to sound like an advert for Microsoft, but Microsoft Sway is just another product in a sense. It's another tool. I think the accessibility that Sway does afford is fantastic, actually. I think in the crib sheet, I think we did make reference to the fact that actually there are different views that you can use to overlay. So if somebody has difficulties in reading or has other issues around being able to access this, there are ways in which that can address a number of those facts, which I think in terms of audience is really important. So the audience is many, you know, it is scrutiny, it's council, it's the whole of, you know, the social services network across Wales, and for me, primarily, it is for people. Actually, how often do the people that we support have any chance of accessing some of what we write about in the name of? So that's the whole emphasis behind it. So the accessibility, I think there is something about how we help people understand how you access that, and I think we've tried to do that, and we can certainly do some more of that in the background. I think in terms of last year, this year, and the figures issue, I think that's a fair point, and I think it is something that we could have we could have put some. Sorry. Oh, sorry. But in terms of the main text, I think when you click into the links in each of the sections, you've got the comparisons through the year. So I don't know if you've managed to get to that section, but if you read each of the quality standards. And in every section, it links you to a full data set of information. So I think what I'm picking up is that actually navigating, if people haven't had a chance to navigate fully yet or understand fully the run of the score, if you like, you won't have got to all the information. But it's fair to say all the information is in there. But you do have to go through it. You know, you do have to click on where it says click on and etc. But the information is there. The specific comment around carers, I think it's certainly an issue that's very close to our hearts. We put a lot of effort into supporting carers in Monmouthshire. They are a workforce in themselves, and actually if they were to give up, in a sense, saying I can't do this anymore, or we didn't support people well enough, we would have, you know, even more pressure in our system. The carers team that are set up, very much actively trying to get information out to people. And I think it's fair to say that not everybody wants to identify themselves as a carer or bring themselves forward for support, but actually we have a range of different ways of meeting that need. So there are those people who we can count in a statistic, and then there are other people who are, if you like, outside of that statistic, but are having support. And certainly the carers team with their database and their newsletter and the days that they run, they do see carers coming in and out of that support, but without that formal recognition that they are a number in our system. So I always think it's one of the areas that always comes up for scrutiny, and rightly so. But there is a lot of work that goes on to support those carers in Monmouthshire. Have I covered the three?
Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to return to the issue that my colleague Councillor Edwards raised with Ms Rogers about the number of children and young people who, the number of children and young people who you're dealing with who might in some way be at risk. She was asking about age profile. I'd like to ask you about economic profile. You may know that a recent report suggested that over 40% of the children in the ward I represent are considered to be living in poverty. And I just wonder if there is any sign of a link between the rise in concern about the welfare of young people and, for example, the number of families who are using food banks, the number of adults who are suffering as a result of austerity, whether there's a direct link in any way.
I think it would be hard for me to say, yes, categorically there's a direct link. We don't collect our kind of figures in that way. But from speaking from an on-the-ground point of view, whilst poverty and economic hardship doesn't lead directly to people neglecting or abusing their children, there is certainly a correlation, and that correlation exists because of the additional pressures, strains, hardships that families living in poor social economic conditions experience. So that additional kind of economic, social pressure that families that we will all know of are living under will create conditions where the welfare of children are compromised. And that is just because of that kind of ripple effect that you're living from in a kind of situation where you're hand to mouth, not knowing where your next meal is coming from, the emotional and mental health well-being kind of issues that puts you under, the strain on your relationships, the strain within family environments. You know, all the social workers out there are kind of know in their day-to-day jobs that this is the reality that that children and families are living under. And I think it would be, you know, on a national scale, you know, if we could really kind of collate some of those statistics in a real cause and effect way. I don't know how you do that exactly, but I think it would paint a telling picture. And that, you know, who knows what's going to happen over the next 5 years. And when we're kind of looking nationally at the increase in the rates of looked after children on the Child Protection Register, for us to, I think nationally within Wales, to not really be able to kind of make some better stabs at kind of understanding the link between that and the kind of more kind of social economic factors that come to play is to our loss, really, because I think it's really part of that understanding. Now, I absolutely know that social workers take that into account when they're doing their assessments, but that kind of the bigger impact, you know, being able to say that on a bigger scale from a facts and figures point of view is hard to pin.
Councillor Grocott.
If I could just come back on that to say that I'm sure we'll all be very relieved to have heard the Chancellor's statement yesterday that austerity is now over. But then again, so did his predecessor, and he's subsequently been thrown out of his party.
Okay. We'll keep out of the political side at the moment. Now, this is a scrutiny committee. Edwards.
Yes, following on again from Councillor sat next to me. Years ago, I mean, I come from a large family and a large extended family. and things were hard, obviously, when our parents were after the war and so on. But is there not the difference today where, I suppose, families are more mobile and people move about the country far more, that there isn't that sort of support that isn't highlighted with extended family support, like with aunties and uncles, and there must be some hidden families, so to speak, that are struggling, but they've got extended family that help out with buying the shoes or clothing children or feeding them or something. And I think more so today when we've got more and more children being brought up in a single parent family, and they haven't got that extended family to help support with children or childcare, even if one of the parents are working. So I think maybe there are some families that are in need of support and help that are finding it difficult to make ends meet, but it's sort of been hidden because there's other family members that are helping out. Do you know what I mean? So I think perhaps the way that society is today perhaps exacerbated the makeup of the family that is so different today to what it used to be.
I couldn't agree with you more to all the factors that you raise. It's like almost two elements. I think Councillor Jones may well echo me here in the sense that as we've been kind of listening to care leavers, children who've been through that system, kind of realising more and more that loneliness and isolation doesn't just affect our kind of elderly population. It really is a feature of our young people's lives. I think by extension, we know that there are many families who've lost that connection to their extended families, to the communities that they live in. These issues are realities for some parenting child kind of situations. And it's so hard, I think, to really understand the complexities of the worlds that we live in now and that families really operate in now. All the kind of traditional systems, or many of them, have really have broken down. Roles and relationships within families have really shifted. The kind of emphasis on what it means to be a parent has really shifted. There's so many kind of pressures on families. And then on the other side of it, you may well have extended families, but they may have well been through generations of a kind of abuse, kind of neglected, environmentally poor situations themselves. So really the level of help and the support they're offering may well not be that helpful to the next generation of children coming through. So it kind of really works both ways. Of course, we have many families now, and increasingly so, where they don't have a history in this part of the world. They're incomers, and that makes a different kind of scenario again. So yeah, many different and complicated factors impacting on family life, and there's sometimes not much to anchor some of these families in, and therefore these children find themselves in what are really quite desperate situations where really the only options for them are to come into care. And that can be a very good, positive outcome.
Can I just make a point there? I'm Vice Chair of Corporate Parenting, and I was at the engagement evening with care leavers, and I think sometimes we concentrate on the very young and those children going into care. But that was a heartbreaking evening, and I don't say that lightly, listening to some of those stories, and really for young people at 18 without any support, and I know the authority does its best from 18 to 25, they've had very difficult times, but they don't have that normal support that people born into an extended family or a solid sort of family have. And I would emphasise, in terms of engagement, I think that is an ongoing issue, and it is very important. It's not what we think young people or even smaller children want. We need to try to find out from them, to a certain degree, what is best for them. And I know that's not possible in all scenarios, but I do think that engagement, I welcome that and would actively encourage it. Councillor Jones.
It says there that there's 173 children were in the care of the local authority, and Monmouthshire has 65 foster carers. How serious is the situation then? Because I'm assuming that a lot of these 173 are in foster care, and if not, where are they cared for? And what is the reality in that sense of where these children are?
Well, they all are somewhere. Haven't lost any. Yes, it's a bit of a confusing picture. I should say, we always need more foster carers. It's an ongoing priority for us. Our recruitment of good quality Monmouthshire carers is one of our top priorities, and it has been for the last 3 years, and it will continue to be so. And we make good progress. I know we've got 5 foster carers going through our fostering assessment process at the moment that can offer then generic placements to children. So it's an ongoing thing for us. That said, the figure, the headline figure of how many children are looked after, there's always quite a hefty breakdown of that in terms of the placements they're in. And I can't give you off the top of my head the exact numbers, but I know, for example, at the moment we have 40 children who are in our care, so come into that 173 figure, but are being looked after by their parents. So they're in our care, they're on full care orders to us, which means that we share parental responsibility, but they actually reside with their parents. We then have another quite significant cohort of children. I don't want to estimate, I guess, but it's a significant chunk of that 173. They're on their care orders to us, but they reside with a connected person, as we call it, so a family member or somebody who is a carer just for them. So they too go through a full fostering assessment, but they are only approved to care for a specific child or group of children. We have a large cohort of children who fall under that category. And then we have a smaller category. It's about the same normally, kinship and generic, who are in those 65 generic carers, generic placements. Now, of course, if we can't place, for whatever reason, with a Monmouthshire carer, either because we haven't got anybody who's available or we haven't got anybody who can meet the identified needs of that particular child, then we would always look for an alternative foster carer through an independent agency. And then we've got a smaller cohort of children again, usually about 10 or 11, who aren't in foster care at all, and they're in residential placements, and that's, I'd say, 99% of the time, because that is the type of placement that's going to meet that particular child's needs. So although you see 173 looked after children, only 65 foster placements or foster carers, it does look like, you know, there's a crisis there. And of course we always want more carers, as I've said, but it's not quite as stark as that initial kind of figure gives you. And some of those 65 foster carers, it's some of those are couples, so it's actually less fostering households than 63 will be offering more than one placement.
I'm encouraged by that. Sorry. In the case of a situation where an emergency arises, does the lack of foster parents compromise the decision that you might make because of an unsuitable place to place a child?
It doesn't, no. We do have those crises where we've suddenly got a child on our hands who needs an emergency placement, but we're well equipped as a service to respond to those situations. We have an order of preference. We always look first to our own carers. Well, to be honest, even in an emergency, we'll always look to the child's own family, friends, connected people in the first instance. Then we'll look at our own carers. Then we'll look at contact with an independent fostering agency. And, you know, so far, by hook or by crook, we've found placements that are responsive and relevant to the child's needs. Then that gives us time to kind of take stock and plan for a more permanent arrangement.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yeah, coming back to the original comments that I made with regard to accessibility, I mean, I think there is some learning in terms of how to use Sway, and I think obviously that might be difficult in terms of learning for the population in general. You know, not only myself who isn't terribly computer literate, but also for other people as well. I did notice that what you've said is correct in terms of the performance standards, where you click into them and you can see the tables. But I think in terms of accessibility, it would be helpful if there was an appendix at the end that said sort of like standard 5, you know, this is the performance table, because you've got to go through an awful lot to find the sentence that says this is standard such and such, click here. And in terms of tables, it will be easier in terms of scrutiny for us to actually look at that if it was incorporated into the report. I mean, that's just a suggestion, because I think the performance indicators on the tables are important, and obviously the general description about how this is affecting service users is very useful and helpful as well. But I think, you know, it has to be balanced a little bit by the sort of facts and figures as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Louise Brown. I think as well there's an implication for training for members, actually, you know, to Matt in terms of the use of Sway, because it is a relatively new system. It's not something that I've used before, but I think those points are valid. I'll hand over now to Councillor Francis Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you for the report, Julie. I think that you know, it's an interesting format, and it has, you know, certainly got some really positives in terms of being able to, watch video, all sorts of things that you can do with it. So I think that's really helpful. I do concur with Councillor Brown, however, about perhaps the tables, the performance tables. It might be slightly easier if that is an appendices to the main body of the report, and then obviously you can go into all the other sections. That's just one thing. For our purpose, for scrutiny, I think being able to see the comparator and seeing it in context is actually quite helpful as an appendices, which we don't have to go looking for the links to click into. So I completely agree with you. You have to read it all if you really want to understand the whole thing. But sometimes there is something about where that is that makes it easier or harder. So that would just be a comment. I've got a couple of questions, if I may, which relate mainly to adults, which you would probably expect. But also a more general one first of all. So I was looking at the priorities that you have in your report, and there are 9 of them. And I was just, because I was relating it to what Jane was saying about the fact that foster caring is a priority for us. The priorities are very general. That was my first observation, and don't lead me easily to see, I think, how those priorities are being delivered in themselves. So, for example, there is no reference to foster caring at all in the 9 priorities. So it wouldn't necessarily lead me to believe, if I was reading the report, that foster caring was a priority for social care. Anyway, that's the first thing. The second thing about the priorities really is that they are very broad. I think it really would be more helpful. To understand what an example of change looks like. So, for example, if I take the last priority, which is developing partnership working across all sectors and pooling resources, I was going to say, can you give me an example of a change? So that's my first question. I'm going to do mine just, 3 questions like this. So a comment is that they're broad. They're quite difficult, I think, to hold to account for, really. That would be what I would say. Secondly, my question regarding adult services. So you say in your report that we provide services and support for 2,500 people. So a lot of people across Monmouthshire. In the Dare to Care element, or care at home, I understand, turning the world upside down. We've had some discussions. You are looking at a different way of working with people, which really focuses less on task and more on what people want to do, what matters to them. But I note that at the
current time, only 55% of adults feel they can do things that matters to them. So essentially around 1,200 people don't feel that they can do things that matter to them. And I was noting that we were saying we were making good progress on that. And I just wonder how we feel we're making good progress on that when actually perhaps it doesn't show at the moment in the data potentially. So that's the second question. The third question then relates to the increase in delayed transfers of care. So you talk about the fact that it's, it's sometimes increasingly difficult to find the care that people need in order that they leave hospital when they are well. And I wondered if you could give a little more detail on that commentary. So what is it that is the most difficult thing there? And also just obviously it's a number. I'm sure there is a table somewhere which actually will tell me that the number of days that is actually rather than just a person being in hospital. So it would be helpful. And the last thing really then, because we talk about different services in different places, is there any kind of postcode lottery in Monmouthshire in terms of the adult social care one could expect to receive? And how can we be assured that no matter where we live in a county, adults requiring service are able to access what they need and what matters to them? So that's 4 questions, isn't it? Thank you. Is that all right? Sorry.
Thank you. I've made a note, and we'll do a bit of a tag team between myself and Eve, I think. In terms of the comment around the priorities, I think that's a fair point. It's one of the challenges is deciding what level we're going to be talking. So are we getting into the detail, which obviously a lot of the specificity comes. I took an approach which was very much broader themed, and I do take the point about the fact that actually how can you then pinpoint certain activity. I think it's fair to say that if we did, and I think some of the priorities that exist in our service plans, if those were, I dread to think hyperlinked in because that would even make it bigger, but actually a lot of the detail exists in the service plan arena. So lifting those up into broader themes has been the approach that we've taken. But I do think, the issue about fostering, actually in the context of the report, in the summary, in the children's section, you've got a PowerPoint presentation that lays out quite a lot of the significant priorities and transformation that's going on in children's. And also we do reference the issue around the foster carer strategy and campaign. So it is in there. I accept that it's not all in one place answering the question in a linear way. So I think, we can certainly, look at how would we help members, and I've got to obviously present to council in a few weeks' time. How do we help people navigate through what is a lot of information, but and trying to make sure that most of that information is there. But yes, in terms of the priorities, they are broad themes, and I think most of those themes are covered in the context in the report. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The example specifically, Councillor, that you gave around the pooled, again, that broad theme is trying to capture some of the wider work that we're doing across the health board. So not only are we delivering support, in a Monmouthshire context, we work very, very closely with our health board. And as part of our regional partnership board work, which again is referenced, some of the work that we've been doing around pooling resources, whether that's in a statutory instrument known as a Section 33, or whether that is just us looking at what opportunities there are for us to pool resource and deliver more efficient and more effective services together. So it's a broad aspiration, perhaps more than a distinct priority, and I'm more than happy to, in a sense, explain where some of that work does happen. Third, DTOC. I think I'm going to ask Eve to answer this one.
Thank you, Julie. The DTOC, it has been, I think, we're probably in a more difficult position than we have been at, in previous years. And a lot of that is around the problems that we have with the independent market from a domiciliary care perspective. Councillor Taylor talked about whether we can be sure that we have equity across the county, and I think it would be fair to say that we don't necessarily have equity across the county because we know where our most difficult areas are. So central Monmouthshire is, so Monmouth and the Usk area are the most difficult areas for us to maintain a good state from a domiciliary care perspective. That's both in-house and external or commissioned services. So those areas are the ones that we've been targeting most our efforts to try and improve the situation. So we've recently done a pilot or a test of change in the Usk area where we've worked particularly with one provider to provide a certain number of hours to alleviate the situation, and that's proving very positive. That sits alongside the project that we're doing around turning the world upside down, so hopefully we'll be able to roll that out broader. I think we all know that the domiciliary care issues are national issues and not something that's just a problem in the Monmouthshire area, but talking to Gwent partners, I think Monmouthshire is an area where we do have more difficulties than other areas. I think some of that's because of our demographics, because of our rurality, and you can see why the central areas of Monmouthshire will be the most difficult areas to recruit and retain. We never stop looking at ways to improve the situation, and we've recently, in fact yesterday, got some the okay to use some of the intermediate care funding that's come from Welsh Government to use some ways of incentivising people to come into Monmouthshire to work in the domiciliary care market by helping them with some start-up costs, so that perhaps coming into Monmouthshire might be more affordable for people working in that area. The situation has improved though as the year has gone on. Around Christmas time last year it was a little bit more difficult than it is now, so that is improving. There are other areas where we have challenges with delayed transfers of care. Some of those are around housing, and we've been working very closely with Ian Bakewell in the housing sector to look at ways that we could use interim housing options for people. And we're also looking at ways that we could use some of the vacancies that we have in some residential and nursing homes as step-up, step-down beds. We're very mindful, though, that that needs to be delivered in a very considered way so that it is the right option for those individuals and that we have the right services there to make sure that we do get them home, because home first is obviously our priority. And I think that sometimes we get a lot of pressure from the Health Board to just put people in residential and nursing homes as a solution, when in actual fact it's not a good long-term solution. Thank you.
Sorry, are you able to say, about the whether there is an example of sorry, Eve, you're right. If there's an example, Julie, of a pooling resource with another partner that you can give, just as an illustrative point.
Yeah.
And sorry, just the point about the priorities was, for us, I appreciate what you're saying about high level, it's hard to hold to account against a priority where it's not really that specific, I think, is what I'm trying to... I appreciate what you said, and of course there is reference to fostering. I used that as an example, because if, as an outside person or someone who's scrutinising it or whatever my interest is, I can't tell. I can see clearly there's work going on about fostering. You would imagine that in any county in the whole of the Wales, I would think, anywhere. But I can't see that that's one of our priorities. Am I making sense? So just to be clear. I can't see from this that this is a priority. There are 9 priorities, and so therefore there are service plans sitting underneath that. So I do wonder then, what are our priorities? Are you with me? Just to reflect back.
I think I am. I think it's fair to say I could have 50 priorities because there are, in fact, I think it's probably more like 500 priorities. I suppose I think there is something about it is trying to. I get the issue about holding to account, absolutely, but we have to almost filter some of the priorities. So yes, fostering is a priority, ongoing all the time, and has been for quite some time. I suppose it is much more about, so what is emerging over the next, 12 months or so, and fostering will continue being a priority, and we'll continue putting all our effort in. And so it isn't a pinnacle priority, it's just a priority that runs through everything that we do. But I do take that point. The pooling resources, I mean, we have several Section 33s in Monmouthshire around our integrated services that actually pool all our resources together with the Health Board. We're part of a Shared Lives project. We could go on. We have many examples of pooled examples. And I suppose that's not the tension, it's the sort of the difficulty in presenting something. If we go into all of the detail, it makes this 3 times longer. So which bits do we bring that can give a flavour and allow scrutiny, and also give some of that depth about where we're going. Just on the Dare to Care and the recruitment issue, just to sort of mention that as well, and a little bit more on the DTOC, I suppose. Again, it's a bit like the fostering example. We don't stop in terms of that, trying to look at ways in which we can bring people into our market to work in Monmouthshire. Blaenau Gwent are not having the same problems as us, and Torfaen are not having the same problems as people want or are able to facilitate and work in care. We have a demographic of people who perhaps work outside of the authority or have a higher aspiration. Part of the challenge for us is really making the image of care work a really attractive offer, which it is. A number of us started in that area. It's a fantastic offer for people, and we're beginning to get traction. We're beginning to work, but it is non-stop. So it's an ongoing priority. And just in terms of DTOC, I think, you've heard me say this before, it is a blunt measure on a day, once a month. It doesn't tell the whole story. And so actually, even though our number has gone up, and it's gone up for all the reasons that Eva's described and others, we are challenging at the moment with our health colleagues, how do we make this much more sustainable? Because everybody's getting measured by a number that actually the day after or the day before will be a completely different number. So it's almost futile. Yes, we have to have something that measures. But I think just to finish, there's a big piece of work going on across the Health Board with ourselves and the Gwent region to say we have to have a better system of working through from somebody coming into A&E to getting out the other end. It has to be slicker, quicker, and it doesn't need all the layers that are currently in that system. So I'm hoping that by this time next year, we might be in a different position, and we might even have a different measure, which I think, because we can get down a rabbit hole with DTOC when actually work is going on all the time to facilitate all the factors that mean that people do get through that hospital system as quickly as possible.
Councillor Grocott, briefly now, please.
I'd like to come back to domiciliary care, if I may. We have had reports about the way in which, as an authority, we are seeking to work with private companies in the domiciliary care area and to give them some support in the way in which they can then guarantee services to us. And I think that's very commendable. But you hear over and over people who run private care companies saying that they are simply not able to survive on the amount of money that local authorities are able to give them to provide services as a result of the amount of money that you are given. So it's an economics question again, I think. But are we in a position in Monmouthshire where we can put hand on heart and say the private providers that we use are economically sound and there is no risk that they will go under? And if they did go under, what would be the consequence for the people who receive their services?
Well, we almost had a test of that last Christmas, didn't we, with Allied? I think that, you know, we had to sort of batten down the hatches then and make sure that we were able to provide care, which we got over that very well. I think one of the most important things is the relationship we have with our independent sector. We meet with our providers on a regular basis. Each of the 3 areas, as we sort of are divided into, meets up with the providers from their areas on a regular basis, so we can look at all the issues that we're all facing around recruitment, retention, sustainability, viability, etc., etc. And part of the work that we're doing around turning the world upside down is to, I think turning the world upside down is looking at a variety of things. One, it's looking at the way that we provide care, much more on that relationship-based way of working than that transactional. So the way that we commission will be much less around the 4 calls a day to do A, B and C. It will be much broader about what's important to that person and what does a good day look like. But also what turning the world upside down is looking at how we make sure that sector is sustainable in a demographic like Monmouthshire. So we're looking at Monmouthshire from a place-based perspective. So we're looking at 12 or 13, we're still negotiating around the table, 12 or 13 areas, which we will be looking at different cost systems to support the private sector. So a company working, say, in Abergavenny town, their costs will be a lot less than somebody, a company that's working in Abergavenny rural. So we're going to be factoring those into the way that we commission those services. And we're doing that very much in partnership with those companies. So we're not saying to them, this is what we're going to do. We're getting round the table with them and saying, this is what we think it would look like. What does that look like for you? The appetite there, in fact, we've just finished meeting with all our providers, and the appetite is very positive, and they're all very excited to go on that journey. Is there anything you want to add to that, Julie?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And, you know, first and foremost, I'd really like to thank the 4 people who've come along today to present the report and given us such a comprehensive report. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. In terms of the sort of summing up, I'm going to do part of it. I'll hand over then to Councillor Francis Taylor, who is chair of Adult and obviously more expert in this area than I am. I'm not on Adult Select. But certainly, looking back on the meeting, one of the key issues that's come out today is the advent of the new system, the SWAY, which I must admit was something new to me. Councillor Louise Brown has raised a number of issues there which are valid in terms of actually using it. And obviously, we're on a fairly steep learning curve in terms of this new format. There probably is some concern as well about the general public accessing it. We've got better support as members to be able to access support, and that is certainly an issue of concern. There's certainly an issue in terms of training for members, I think, which I pass on to my colleague Matt here. Some of the other issues, a very valid point raised by Councillor Martin Grocott about this issue of poverty, and certainly in some of the areas across the authority, and whether there is perhaps, and I appreciate it will be difficult, but some opportunity to collect data in terms of the socio-economic background of, for example, children going into care, and I don't know whether that is possible. And then another point in terms of keeping on. I know there's been a very strong campaign to recruit foster carers, which in this authority is quite difficult, again, because of socio-economic factors. But that has been, to a large degree, effective, but obviously it needs to be more effective. So I think that needs remain a priority in terms of looking after children within the authority, not having to send them out elsewhere, and also from a cost factor, in the sense that it is more cost effective to keep children within the authority, and it is better for them. Hand over now to my colleague Francis Taylor, who was chair of Adult.
I think we've had some really good discussion, though. Also, just to add about that point around the trends for looked after children and the work that's we commend the work that's been done, members, I would imagine, around preventing children from getting into that longer term care system, working with families who are perhaps have been identified as having some matters that could be resolved with some support, and I think that's a really positive intervention. I think also thanks to Julie for the responses around the priorities, so perhaps we can just make a note of that and just perhaps add that to how the presentational issue and also the issue around the data. I think that's really helpful. Totally appreciate the comments made around delayed transfers of care and that being a number, but I think I raised that because there was some narrative in the report which relates to the wider domiciliary care issue. So I think we need to note that wider domiciliary care issue. We are having a full report to the next Adult Select on domiciliary care, and I think we'll be able to explore that issue much further, both in terms of the work that is being done to move towards what matters to you in terms of care, but also the issues with the wider providers and what we're doing to address those issues and make care which is, you have to be very talented and have a real desire to do that work, but it can be a great career, as Julie points out. And I think we've also, I think perhaps would want to note, members, that we perhaps are not in a position to necessarily always offer an equitable access, and that there is work underway to address that, and that's perhaps something we wish to follow up in that discussion in the next Adult Select Committee. And I think also, and I wonder whether there's, in terms of the access to services outside of the domiciliary care, but just what matters to me, doing the things that adults want to do when they are, receiving service. I think any other matters that we would want to note? I mean, I think we would want to perhaps when we do write to the cabinet member, we will note these, Councillor Jones, and ask if there's any response wider. Sorry.
One final point that I would want to make is certainly going back to the engagement evening with care leavers. I think that issue of engagement needs to continue to be a priority in the future. Briefly, Councillor Louise Brown.
Yeah, just a very quick one. If the committee agrees and if the chairs agree, I would like to make a recommendation that there's an appendix which actually with a headline of each standard, like standard 5, and then it provides the tables underneath, so that when this report goes elsewhere, either to Cabinet or Council, those tables are available within the report rather than clicking through to find them through a lot of pages, and it's just a clearer presentation. That's all. If you're happy with that, thank you.
Yes, I think we'll accept. Thank you for well, thank you very much for your time and all of your efforts. It is very much appreciated. Certainly I see it more from corporate parenting perspective, but diolch yn fawr am eich gwaith. And keep up with your enthusiasm and hard work. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. if you would, please. Thank you. Okay, well, time is running now, so we'll make a start back. We just had a very brief interlude. Obviously, welcome members now, officers, and the Cabinet member, Richard John, who are going to talk us through the corporate plan. I've also been informed that another senior officer, Kath Fallon, who's in a meeting with the Welsh Government, is on standby to come in on the social justice issue. So she will be messaged by my colleague here, Matt Gatehouse. But just quick taking of the laptops now. Hand over now to our presenter, Richard Jones. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll do a brief introduction to the report. I'm grateful for colleagues and Cabinet members joining us today with the responsibility for the areas covered within it. So here to present the performance report for the corporate plan in 2018-19. As members were aware, the core plan was approved in February 2018. It restated the Council's long-standing purpose of building sustainable and resilient communities and set 5 priority goals, which are also the Council's wellbeing objectives, and underneath those set a number of commitments to action, 22 in total, which the Council is committed to delivering. And Appendix 1 shows how our corporate plan interacts with our performance framework in terms of setting direction, and also how those other plans contribute to the delivery of the corporate plan. So the report in front of you today in Appendix 2 provides you with an overview of the goals which are particularly relevant to adults and Children and People's Select Committee. So Goal A, providing the best possible start in life, particularly relevant for children and young people, and Goal D, lifelong wellbeing, particularly relevant for Adults Select Committee. And the structure of the report shows you an overview of performance that's been achieved in the year, and then an update against each of the commitments that have been made and the progress against what we said we would do. And then at the back of the report, each report then gives an overview of how each of those goals contribute to the Future Generations Act, both in terms of the wellbeing objectives set under the Act and also in terms of the ways of working, and then a table of performance measures which give a broad indication of some of the progress made against the activity in each of the goals. We've provided for each of the goals, tried to provide a summary rating. So there's 2 ratings within the report. The first one is against each of the commitments. So it hopefully shows at a high level, based on the activity and evidence in the report, how each of the commitments is progressing. And the second one is based on the goals performance overall, which has been based on the Council's self-evaluation framework. And Goal A has been scored as level 3 adequate, and Goal D has been scored as level 4 good. Finally, Appendix 3, a short appendix, gives you an overview of some of the key performance measures that are used as part of what's known as the public accountability measures. And these are measures that are particularly important for benchmarking local authority performance. The ones relevant to the committee are included in that report. There are other relevant measures in that framework related to adults and children's social care and also related to educational attainment. Those haven't been included because you've already scrutinised lots of those throughout your work during the year. And for example, the report earlier went into a lot of detail around those, so they haven't been duplicated in this report. One thing just to highlight in terms of your consideration of the scrutiny of performance, the corporate plan is an ambitious 5-year programme. Obviously, some of the challenges it's looking to address are complex, and some of the impact of some of the mechanisms we put in place may not be clearly demonstrable over the short term. Nonetheless, hopefully the report gives you an understanding about some of those milestones that we've put in place and where we can, some of the evidence of impact that has been made already. And also just to highlight, probably lots of the areas and activity covered in the report are familiar to you as a committee. They've probably been on your work programmes over the last 12 months. Some of it may be on your future work programmes. So in terms of your scrutiny, you may want to consider the work areas you've already scrutinised as part of that. And that's understandable given our corporate plan is obviously some of our priority areas that you will be scrutinising those on an ongoing basis. And finally, just to conclude, that as well as being presented to you today, the goals will also be in our fuller annual report, which is presented to Council on 9th September. That provides a fuller evaluation of performance, not just against the goals, but also against some of our arrangements relative to the Future Generations Act as well. So that'll be coming forward to Council on the 19th of September. So I'm happy to take any questions in line with the recommendations, Chair, and obviously colleagues and Cabinet members join us as well for any points of detail related to their responsibility areas.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you for taking us through that. Any questions or comments now that people might wish to make? Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a series of questions that I think are based around the effectiveness of the way in which we measure performance. And to put that in, to make that perhaps a bit clearer, the agenda item, this is entitled Corporate Plan to Hold Cabinet Members to Account. And I think one of the weaknesses of a cabinet system that we are at risk of falling into is that the cabinet sets its priorities and then the cabinet measures its success against them. And I know there is a very clear role for scrutiny, but I think just in the way in which this is currently formed, whether there isn't a greater role for scrutiny in challenging and actually establishing the success of outcomes. Now, from that, I've got a series of questions which actually I'm trying to tease out the effectiveness of the judgments, because I spent many years having to write reports on the effectiveness of schools where the use of language was very precise. And for example, if a key indicator around a judgment was not met, then it could not be seen to be an adequate provision. So, with your permission, Chair, I'd like to ask a series of questions, and then at the end of it to see if I and other members of committee are satisfied that in fact the judgments are sound and are based, and then to look at the wider political way in which we make these judgments, because it's certainly something I will come back to when this report goes to County Council and is obviously then in a more political, overtly political framework. And if that makes sense, perhaps I could start by looking at the first lot of judgments, those around our first priority about the best possible start in life, where Mr. Jones has said that the judgment is that the provision is adequate. Well, I'd like to, first of all, point out that the report says that over recent years, education provision has been improving, and this is a quote, but in 2018 showed progress in reverse, and particularly foundation stage not at the levels expected, and then it goes on to look at the end of school career, Key Stage 4 not at the levels expected. Well, it seems strange that this leads to a judgment of adequate. Other examples, a new models of delivery for additional learning needs and inclusion services has been undertaken. Well, we are still, I know that in a sense you could say, yes, there was one bit of that was dealt with. There was a report published. But now we are still in a position where a key element of our provision at Mountain House School is still undecided 2 years on from the start of an ALN review. Again, does that sound like adequate? It talks then about a real focus in the last year to implement a coordinated approach to early intervention and prevention. Fantastic to see talk of a coordinated approach. On the other hand, school after school has had to cut services to young people with additional learning needs because the number of teaching assistants has been reduced because of real-time funding diminution to schools. So if individual children are having services reduced or withdrawn in terms of individual support for literacy or numeracy, again, how is that adequate? And I wonder in terms of coming back to Mountain House, every child who enters Mountain House will, as part of that process, have received a medical diagnosis from the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service, one would hope. And certainly in terms of the Director of Social Services report earlier this morning, talking about links with health. I would like to ask a very specific question because the rest of Britain seems to be having huge problems with links between education and health in this area of young people's mental illness, and whether there is sufficient resource there, not only for diagnosis, but then for dealing with that. So my first question is, with all of these things, how do you possibly justify that the service is adequate overall?
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Crockett. Who's going to... Mr McLean, Will McLean.
So just start in terms of maybe providing clarification around those progress ratings that are included, and maybe let colleagues answer some of the specific points in terms of the detail you've raised. So the rating of adequate is based on the overall assessment of each of the commitments provided in the report. And we have gone to try and include in the report explanations about why each individual action has made progress and the evidence we feel that sits around that. And aggregating all those up based on our self-evaluation framework, taking them all, I think there's 15 detailed actions and they've taken all 15 overall that it's been scored as adequate. Notwithstanding that, clearly, within each of those, there are areas where it's identified in the report we haven't performed as we'd like, or the areas where we need to improve. Part of the way we wanted to make sure in terms of that adequate rating overall, we could break that down so members and the public could understand at a more detailed level how we perform, is to provide the progress rating against each of the commitments to action. So, for example, in the update around Commitment 2, Council's plan for raising standards in schools, we've recognised some of the challenges that we faced there and have put that as progress rating of attention needed, showing that further work and focus that colleagues are doing to try and strengthen that area. So that's how we've tried to, in each of the commitments, break that down and just give a high-level summary based on our framework, accepting that when you look at individual points, there's clearly evidence of progress that's been made, and there's also evidence where some things aren't performing the way we'd like. But that's how we've tried to work the progress rating overall, just to give you, I guess, a snapshot view. But obviously, clearly, as you pointed out, the evidence under each of the commitments and what we said we do gives you the further detail, some of which shows progress, some of which shows areas which haven't performed as we intended to. That's where the overall aggregation comes in. Hopefully that helps clarify some of the rating. But colleagues want to pick up on some of the detail.
Mr Will McLean, Senior Officer for CYP.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Yeah, thank you, Richard, for your explanation. And it is that kind of view across the whole set of all of those different things. And certainly, I'm absolutely aware of the precision with which the inspectorate write and the very clear way in which they define some of the terms, and that they have very, very specific meanings, both in terms of the proportion of pupils achieving and so on, but also in terms of the judgments that they make. But this isn't a regulator's report. I think Richard's rightly described how we formed that judgment over the whole piece. I'd also just like to stress my absolute agreement with Councillor Grocott that last year foundation phase outcomes at the expected level were not at the level we'd have hoped to have seen. We are still achieving a very high level in terms of the expected level, but clearly it had fallen from the previous year, and that's not what we expect. And exactly the same goes for the end of Key Stage 4. However, across the 4 key stages 2 and 3, both showed improvement in performance at both the expected and the expected level +1 or +2 at Key Stage 3. So I think it's fair to say across that whole piece, we're trying to form a judgment across that thing, but we have been clear that at foundation phase and at Key Stage 4, progress was not where we'd expect it to be. And also, just for clarity around the piece around the ALN, absolutely recognise that we're still in that process. We did, when we took the consultation report back to Cabinet, say that the future of Mountain House wasn't clear and that we'd need to recast and reconsult on those proposals. We are in doing that, and I know there'll be a report coming to this committee on the 17th of September prior to it going to Cabinet on the 18th of September, which considers the future of Mountain House School, and that will be the resolution of that part of that consultation process. With regards to the funding of TAs, I can say, knowing the pressures that are within that system, there has not been a reduction in the amount of money that we put into the funding of pupils or funding for pupils who need enhanced provision. That has remained consistent. There might have been a reduction in the numbers of TAs in the school population more generally, but those who are funded through what we call our Band B or Band D or Band E funding for special educational needs has remained consistent and will continue to remain consistent so long as those children present with a clearly evidenced level of additional need. With regards to the relationship with the NHS, and I know Julia will want to make a comment on this, but across the region we're fortunate in having identified young people's mental health as a key priority for the Transformation Fund, which is funded by Welsh Government. Significant work has been undertaken in that area. We're fortunate to have an excellent colleague in Iron Bevan in Luke Jones, who's really leading the way on that. But I'll leave Julie comment a little bit more about that.
Just by way of explanation, in terms of the Transformation Fund, a large chunk of that money is being used to fund an approach that's being called the iceberg model. And it very much tries to actually, if you think about an iceberg, the tip of that, which is, generally speaking, would be access to the secondary CAMS service. Often what has happened is people have not managed to be able to get into that service, and there's been a recognition across a range of professionals that we need to invest in much more medium and low-term support, lower level support for children with mental health issues. And this funding, which is Welsh Government funding, which will run until 2020, is trying to establish whether this way of working can really increase access. I'm one of the lead directors that sits on the partnership board around the Transformation Fund, and some of the early indications are that this work is gathering pace, and it's very much trying to address the issue that Councillor Grocott has mentioned, which has been in the system for a long, long time. We're hopeful that if this is successful, it is going to be something that can be mainstream funded post 2020, but I'm more than happy to give an update on some of the specifics if needed.
Thank you. Councillor Roger Harris, you indicated.
Thank you, Chair. Ironically, my question is following on from Councillor Grocott's on the best possible start in life section. And it says, in particular, foundation phase and key stage 4 were not at the levels expected, and that's already been mentioned. What I would like to see is what happened, why, and what is being done about it. It's a bold statement, not at the levels expected, but it doesn't tell us anything. And I'd like to know why they weren't at the levels expected and what are we going to do about it.
Mr. McLean.
Thank you again, Chair. It's quite difficult, actually, at this stage, because we're obviously reporting in this paper last August's exam results. So in terms of what's happened, this committee has scrutinised those outcomes on several occasions, both in terms of verbal updates from me, in terms of written updates from the EAS, in terms of the Chief Officer's reports. We've had multiple opportunities in this setting and in Council to discuss FSM performance. We have received the EAS's business plan for the current year, which is exactly addressing what they're doing to support learners. Come to this committee, it's been to Cabinet for for additional scrutiny and for sign-off. So there's been a lot of work doing around how do we ensure that our learners improve and get better outcomes. So there's a timing issue always with this report in terms of where we are, because clearly we have obviously had the results for last year's GCSE outcomes now. Again, in this committee, we've heard previously about the significant change in the accountability framework and the reporting mechanisms that Welsh Government have introduced this year. So we're not in a position now to talk about them because the results are still very, very draft and unverified in any way. So we haven't had the first cut, the SSSP1. So it's very difficult for me in this report to actually add that level of detail. But I do feel sure and confident that members of this committee have had ample opportunity in the past year to actually really scrutinise what the results were and why they were as they were, but not only that, what we put in place going forward to improve those results.
Mr. McLean, thanks.
Can I come back in there?
Yeah.
I appreciate what Will has just said, and over the years we get bombarded with lots and lots of information. But this is a report that maybe somebody is reading it that hasn't had all that information, and they look at it and think, well, I wonder why. And a sentence or two explaining why it can be explained or explaining why it can't be explained would be rather useful. We mustn't assume that just because we've received all this information, everyone else out there has received all this information, and they might be looking at it and making judgments which aren't fair on us or the other way around. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harris.
Just sort of echo in terms of what Will said and recognise that obviously we're drawing together a diverse range of service areas with lots of specific detail around them. We try and keep our updates proportionate to provide information and evidence-based information on the progress against each. Sometimes it's not always possible to get the absolute full explanation because you're covering such complex and different service areas. So we try and keep it proportionate to that, recognising the further detail that is available for scrutiny members for the other scrutiny you undertake. Appreciating the point around where members may not be to it, but that's we're always trying to keep that balance, whereas too much detail versus too little detail, and trying to get that proportionate right, recognising, as I said at the start, that particularly if you're scrutiny members, you won't be scrutinising these in a lot more finite detail throughout the year, which is to be understandable given they are our priorities in the corporate plan. That will be part of your work programme.
Councillor Richard John, a Cabinet Member.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on some of the points made by Councillors Grocott and Harris so far. I think it's difficult when it comes to summing up outcomes in a single word, particularly when we're looking at the corporate plan. So everything we've done over the last 2 years, and also everything we aspire to do over the remainder of this term. And while we appreciate that committee members will want to see you'll want to go through the detailed exam results with a fine-tooth comb as you do every year. We also need to provide some top-level data for you to see as well. And I think summing up progress across such a broad range of objectives in a single word or in even using a RAG rating is very difficult. I appreciate the difficulty that there must be in giving schools a coloured rating each year when you're assessing such a broad range of data. But in terms of scrutiny, Penny and I are very happy to come along to this meeting whenever it's helpful to members. When we're not here, we do watch your deliberations online. But members are very welcome to come along to any cabinet meetings where there's an opportunity to ask questions. And obviously we have full council as well. But if members feel that there's some sort of a lack of opportunity to scrutinise cabinet members, then perhaps that's something the Democratic Services Committee could look at. But as I say, Penny and I are very happy to come along whenever that's helpful. In terms of performance, as Mr. McLean was saying, we're in a slightly difficult position at the moment because we've just had the summer results from August 2019. We've got some early indications as to what that data shows, but we haven't got any verified data yet, so it's very difficult to comment on standards. I mean, certainly the indications are that a number of our schools have had a really strong year. We've got some early indications of a narrowing of the FSM gap at Key Stage 4. That's something we've been very anxious to see for several years. But we really are going to have to wait and see what the detailed verified data shows later this year. You'll appreciate on vulnerable learners, we were very keen to put some additional money in this year. So we made £75,000 available to our 4 secondary schools for targeted support at our pupils who are eligible for free school meals in Year 11. So our 4 secondary schools put on additional revision sessions. There were breakfast clubs put on specifically for FSM learners on the day of their exams. There was holiday revision sessions. We'll obviously have to evaluate that to see what impact that has had. But that was something we were very keen to do to focus on the narrowing of that gap. While the evidence is that our free school meals pupils do very well earlier on in the education system, we have been concerned for a number of years about Key Stage 4. On funding, we've made some really difficult decisions over the past few years to protect the level of funding that goes to schools. Hopefully, we're going to see some significant improvements following the announcement by the Chancellor yesterday of an additional £600 million going to the Welsh Government. I hope the Welsh Government will be putting that money into education. We've already got a funding gap of hundreds of pounds between Wales and England, and hopefully, if we get some additional money from the Welsh Government, obviously we will want to continue to prioritise school funding. On the timing question about Mountain House, we've got a decision to make at our Cabinet meeting on Wednesday, the 18th of September. Members may recall that we delayed that decision because we had a number of key consultees who hadn't responded to the formal consultation within that consultation period, which ended at the end of April. So we extended the period during which we would continue to receive consultation responses. We had a number of key partners who hadn't responded in time. I also had a request from the Leader of the Opposition to make a late submission, and I said I'd be very happy to receive that. So, as I say, we're due to make a decision the week after next on that. And as I say, on the question about performance, I think it's very difficult to sum that up in a single word, particularly as we're looking at data that's over a year old. But I'm sure you'll be able to see some more up-to-date figures in the coming weeks.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you. I was looking at Appendix 2 and obviously going through the different headings in there. In Appendix 2 it says one of the main goals is giving a best possible start in life. And on page 4 it says, we will invest in all our children's learning and development, ensuring they have the environment, skills and support to flourish and be prepared for the work of the future. Then we come to the point 1 on page 5, which says the council invests in future schools. And then there is number 2, the council has a plan for raising standards in schools. And then there's a subheading on the ongoing focus on vulnerable learners. And then we come to page 7, which talks about the council carrying out a strategic education review, including on additional learning needs review. And obviously there is the mention there of the consultation on the possible closure of Mountain House Special School. So I would ask, when Cabinet actually considers those things, thinks very, very carefully about the need to ensure that basically children do have the best possible start in life, including those who have additional learning needs and SEBD needs, and the needs for those with challenging behaviour to actually who can't operate in a normal school, to have the available local schools for them. And obviously there is a further heading there about investing in future schools, and I haven't seen the investment there. And also with regard to ongoing focus on vulnerable learners, the 21 pupils at Mountain House, 5 out of the 21 were looked after children, and these are vulnerable learners. And I'd like to see hopefully this corporate plan amended to fully support Mountain House School. Thank you.
Councillor Richard John.
Thank you. Well, Councillor Brown has engaged particularly actively on the consultation on Mountain House and submitted a very detailed and thorough response to our consultation. As I say, we're due to make a decision on the 18th of September, but I can assure you that our number one consideration is the well-being of the pupils at Mountain House. And she's absolutely right that pupils who do have social, emotional and behavioural difficulties are a really vulnerable group in Monmouthshire, and we will be it'll be our top priority to do everything we can to support them and ensure that they are educated in the most appropriate environment. And that has always been the key consideration throughout this process.
Yes, thank you. Point.
Yeah, I'd like to come back and now make some observations, if I may, on the fourth of the county's priorities, the developing well-being and adopting community-focused approaches. And again, to emphasise that the reason that I do this is because this is very much in the political arena. The title is to hold Cabinet members to account. And let me say I fully appreciate the comments made by officers here this morning and take them all on board. But at the end of the day, this report is about political outcomes. And because I am such a nice guy and a supportive person to our Cabinet members, I'm actually giving them a heads up on what I might be saying at County Council when we are in the political arena. So I hope you appreciate that, Cabinet colleagues. But again, it comes down to Cabinet members setting objectives and then judging progress. And this is what I'm really trying to get at in terms of scrutiny. Because this particular section is judged as being good. And I have severe qualms about that. Not only because of some outcomes, but about yet whether or no outcomes. For example, how can a service be judged good, such as the care at home service, when the commentary says that it's being completely remodelled? Surely we need very clear evidence of outcomes over time before we can make a judgment that a service like that is good. We then look at one of the goals of leisure, which is to increase young people's access and participation in sport and physical activity. When we cross-section that back to the section 1, it actually records there that there are now fewer young people participating in sporting activity. Again, a reduction in uptake, and yet the outcome is judged to be good. It doesn't make very much sense to me. Also, the very, very serious political judgment that this council made a few months ago to keep tourism, culture, leisure and youth services in-house, having wasted tens and tens of thousands of pounds in consultant fees, in the time that senior officers of this authority spent on it, on the appointment of a Mon-Life board of directors, or only at the last minute, literally almost, to step back and say, we're going to keep it in-house. Now, how is that effective use of public resource and our own staff? And how can such an outcome be judged as good? And a final comment from me here. It talks about reducing child poverty and improving economic inclusion. How can service like that, which should be at the heart of much of what we look to do, be considered good when we have, for example, despite a promise that we would look at it seriously, not made a start on building any council houses? How can it be good when we have children in families waiting to be housed on a long waiting list? Again, how can such severely limiting impacts lead to an overall judgment of good?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Grogat. So who wants to come back on? Councillor John.
On the levels of activity amongst young people, I think we need to recognise there is a limit to what the county council can achieve. We can't control people's lives to such a degree that we can determine how much sport they take part in every week. But I think we do have a responsibility to make the opportunities available. We've got 4 leisure centres in the county, which I think compares quite favourably with a number of other local authorities. I think there's a challenge that I think we've met quite successfully in maintaining 4 leisure centres, although we've had to make budget reductions almost across the board to be able to prioritise social services and education. I think we've done well to not close any leisure centres, and actually we've been doing the opposite. We're trying to improve and upgrade them. I think Monmouth Leisure Centre is a fantastic addition to the town. It's a really impressive facility now, and that really sets the gold standard of what we want to achieve elsewhere in the county. You'll recognise at the end of July we put forward proposals for a complete renovation of Caldecott Leisure Centre, £6 million. And as I say, I think we have a responsibility to make more opportunities available for young people to take part in sport, to take part in physical activity. I think the Monmouthshire Games over the summer were particularly successful. This year we had over 3,500 young people take part, all aged between 5 and 12. And that's a really key age for young people. If you can get them hooked on sport and physical activity while they're in primary school, I think that bodes really well for later life. But as I say, we will do everything we can to support people to adopt a healthier lifestyle, but we can't force people to take part in sport, but we will continue to do everything we can. On the point about Mon Life, I don't think we should be afraid to be a forward-looking council that innovates, that sometimes will take risks, take opportunities. I don't think we should always do things the way we've always done them, because then you're never going to change. But inevitably, sometimes when you innovate, you try to do things differently, you try to break the mold and do things in a more effective way, it's not always going to be the right path. And I think it was right to pursue that option, but to weigh it up and then to make a decision, which is what we did. And as I mentioned about Monmouth Leisure Centre, I think that's an absolutely fantastic facility. You would think that was a private member's gym, not a council-run leisure centre. And if that's the sort of thing that we can deliver in-house, then I think we should continue to aspire to do that and to roll that out across the county so that everyone in Monmouthshire has the opportunity to take part in physical activity in a well-equipped modern leisure centre like that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor John. Councillor Fran Taylor.
I think Councillor John makes some good points. However, and you know, we've heard from Will that the detail in here that we're looking at obviously refers to last year. However, I do think that the points that Councillor Grocott makes about on the evidence, on the balance of the evidence we have, rating things as good or progressing well is quite difficult, I think, to understand and to accept, frankly, when there are. So whilst you may say that, okay, so last year, you know, the proportion of free school meal, children in receipt of free school meal versus non-free school meal was actually, you know, the percentage point gap widened. Our target is, 32.5 percentage points. This year you're suggesting that on the basis of the evidence that you've seen, although it's not, you know, it's draft and so you cannot make a judgment, the activities you've put in place subsequently, so following this, are making a difference. Whilst it's helpful to know that, you know, so hopefully we can take some assurance that there's been some learning, because clearly what it says here was that what was in place before wasn't working. I think that's what I've drawn from that. And what you're saying now is subsequently changes have been made, in particular at Key Stage 4, and so you're looking to see much more positive outcomes. That's what I heard. Is that correct, Councillor John? Without wishing to draw you into making statements you can't make yet because we haven't got the available public data, but you are anticipating better outcomes than are here. That's what I'm hearing. Yeah, sorry.
Councillor John.
As I said, we're in a very, very difficult stage because we've seen some initial figures, but it's unverified data. You know, there's a massive health warning about you know, the small amount of data we've seen, but we are hopeful that there will be a narrowing of the gap at Key Stage 4, which we have been concerned about for a number of years, and we've discussed it regularly and quite thoroughly in here. Obviously, if there has been a significant narrowing of the gap, obviously we will need to, well, regardless, we will need to weigh up the evidence of the impact of the additional money we put in. I mean, just because, I mean, I don't know what you know, the verified data will show in terms of figures, but you can't necessarily draw one action with another outcome. So we will need to weigh up and work closely with our schools to assess the impact that the additional money we put in and the additional support they were able to provide for free school meals pupils, and the impact that had. There may be other factors that contribute to the free school meals outcomes as well, and obviously one cohort in school will vary to another. You know, outcomes will vary from year to year, and particularly with such a small free school meals cohort as we have in Monmouthshire, you will get that volatility from year to year. But we do need to assess the impact that money has had, and if it has benefited free school meals pupils in year 11 this year, then we definitely need to look at whether that's something we can continue. But that's some analysis we will need to do.
Yeah,
so perhaps one of the things that we could be perhaps challenging cabinet members on is perhaps that from year to year is the analysis of, you know, the outcomes and the causality. So, for example, where activities are being put in place previous years, they haven't shown outcomes that we were looking for, because clearly there would, you know, I've sat here many years, year upon year, where we say, well, this is no good, you know, the gap between. We'll use that as an example. There's lots of areas. We'll use free school meal pupils. Oh, and, you know, we're told, well, you know, we're putting in these measures every year, pretty much, because it's clearly, even if it got to 32 percentage points, that's still far too wide, isn't it? So should we be saying that we are anticipating then that we need to see a much better analysis of these measures that are put in place to address the issues that are those wicked problems? One of the things we'd like to see is perhaps the cabinet member being more challenging to their officers, to their chief officers, to other officers on those matters, so that we can have confidence that that process that goes on is as challenging as it can be. That's something that I think I note, you know, a feeling of. And so I'm not saying that you don't have conversations, but how challenging, you know, how far can we push that evidence base? That's the first thing. The second point I wanted to make, so I'm heartened to hear that we may be seeing potentially better performance for vulnerable learners. However, I think it'll have to be pretty good for us to be content with it. And I don't think we should ever really be content. The second point is, again, it picks up on Councillor Groker's point, made a point around, you know, the lifelong well-being piece, where, again, to relate it to the discussion we had briefly with the adult social care report, we say that we're progressing well, that progress is good, but actually we've identified a whole host of issues in providing care to people, domiciliary care in their homes. So again, I don't understand how, when we are in the process of making a change, and, you know, the definition is improvements are becoming evident, that we can say that progress is good or we're progressing well. So that, I think, is a concern that we would want to reflect back to cabinet members. Thank you.
Councillor Penny-Jones.
Yeah, I'd just like to take up a few points, really. I'd like to say first, I haven't said very much today because there was an excellent report setting out absolutely everything to do with social services beforehand. But I'd just like to say, you know, we're not an isolated little island, the Cabinet Office, you know, that just sit there and we don't talk to anybody, and we don't just come in on Cabinet days to have, you know, Cabinet. There's an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. I mean, you know, you really don't know if we challenge the officers or not. It's not something that we do in the corridors. It's something that we, you know, may do when we're having our regular meetings with many different officers, not just the one. So that's one point I'd like to make. Another point I'd like to make is, from social services point of view, I think we have some right to say that progress is going on, is ongoing and good. We've just had an inspection, and some of that feedback was pretty good about how innovative Monmouthshire's changes are and where they're going and what it's achieving. So, you know, let's take them on board as well. And the other thing I'd like to say is really, perhaps we can have more interaction. I would welcome more feedback from the selects. I can't come to everyone, but I'm not invited to many. That's fine. I don't mind. I totally understand. I think it's Paul Matthews who said that, you know, we can be prohibitive if we actually come. We stop, you know, people having real discussion. But, you know, if you want us to come. We are scrutinised. We're held to full account in full council, if you think about it. You can come, you can submit questions to, sorry, I've caught Martin's frog. You can submit questions to Cabinet As long as they're in time, we will answer them. There's a lot that can be done. You know, we can have one-to-ones, we can have meetings. That's fine. But, you know, this isn't, you can't just look at this piece of paper and say that's all there is to it and we look at it. I agree it has to be scrutinised. You know, I was chair of scrutiny and I'm really a fervent, fanatical admirer of it. But, you know, we've got to take other things into account as well. And if we've had an inspection that says certain things are going quite well, such as independent living, then, you know, I think that's progressive. We can say it's adequate. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Penny's absolutely right, and you know, we are available to answer questions or take motions. I mean, you look at our full council agendas. I think there's often there is scope for more questions if members wanted to put some down. I just wanted to come back on the point that Councillor Taylor made about free school meals. We do meet regularly with our secondary schools, and we'll have some robust discussions between us about the summer results and what additional support could have been provided or what could have been done differently. And you know, we'll be having a very detailed discussion with them about the impact that the additional money we put in. But you know, at this stage, it's very difficult to second guess what the results would have been had we not provided additional support. But we'll be having those discussions with the schools who work very closely with their free school meals pupils. They know who they are. When we have meetings with them, they will talk through their free school meals pupils, and they know them really well. So they will be best placed to have discussions with us about the impact that additional resource has had. But it's not just about having offering challenge to officers here. It's also about our relationship with the Education Achievement Service, and we have very robust discussions when we have regular meetings with the of the 5 Gwent cabinet members for education with the EAS, and you'll see that the EAS business plan is put together based on the priorities and the issues that we raise with them. So if you look at the Monmouthshire appendix of the EAS business plan, one of the very top priorities is supporting vulnerable learners because of the focus that the administration has provided. And just on Councillor Taylor's final point about will the FSM gap be satisfactory this year? Will, whatever the figure is, will that be good enough for us? Well, you're absolutely right, no. You know, will the overall results for GCSEs this year, will we say, oh, great, job done, we're happy with that. If we can have that level of performance every year, job done. Of course not. We want every child in the county to be able to achieve as great results as they possibly can. You know, everyone should aspire to the top. And, you know, you look at future corporate plan reviews like this, and I don't think we're ever going to get to the stage where we say that we're content with the results that pupils are achieving. We always aspire more.
No, okay. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to come back to a comment that Councillor Jones just made, because it sums up very succinctly what my concerns are, that Councillor Taylor has put much more succinctly than I ever could, and that I hope will be able to go forward for consideration from this scrutiny. Councillor Jones, in connection with the social services report, saying, if we're doing this really well, why shouldn't this be in the report? Well, I opened my remarks by saying one of my concerns about Cabinet government was the Cabinet sets the measures and the Cabinet judges the measures. So if we cannot have a Cabinet member saying, oh, this bit of a report shows we're doing something really well, can't we put that in the report? I'm not going to embarrass Mr. Jones by asking him directly, but just nod. Would it be fair to say that it's officers that actually set out the measures against which we're going to be measured? I have concerns about the effectiveness of that, but to hear a Cabinet member saying, this is what they said, can't we be judged on that? No, that's not on. And just nod if I'm right, Mr. Jones. We have a set of objective criteria that we measure against, and that's how the judgments are formed.
So in terms of the measures. The measures, part of the report, come from our service areas, so our service areas identify them through their service business plans. There's particular issues that are relevant to them, either through locally set frameworks where there's an issue they're working on and they want to track, or they're measures that come from nationally prescribed frameworks from Welsh Government, and we choose to include those based on the outcomes that we're looking to achieve through the corporate plan.
Councillor
Can I
Penn-Jones.
just come back and say that I didn't say I wanted to be judged on that, or that we should be judged on that, but it should be taken into consideration, is what my terms. Thank you.
Okay. Any other points now on this report before I draw to a conclusion? No. Okay. Certainly, there's been lively discussion regarding the issue that Councillor Groke had raised about the fact that the Cabinet obviously sets the goals and then assesses the success. I'm not quite sure what we can actually do about that. Obviously discussion as well about the ALN review, and in particular Mountain House, which will be resolved in the next few weeks. Concerns still about foundation phase and key stage 4 outcomes. It's sort of at the start and the end of a student's school lifetime, and that does concern me personally as well. I think it's something we need really to keep an eye on. Also the fact that we really need to try to work out whether the additional money that's been put in, as Councillor Richard John, the Cabinet member, said, into secondary schools for vulnerable pupils, has it had a good effect? And I think that is very important, because obviously every authority wants value for money. I do agree as well that there needs to be we've raised the issue about the challenge of the Cabinet member, obviously, to the senior officer in these two areas, and that is an important aspect of the Cabinet member's work. I think I've summed up the main points. I don't know if there's anything else that anybody would want to raise in that. Sorry, Francis?
Just one thing. I think it is true to say that the committee has questioned the judgments that are, made against some of the service areas' progress, and I think that it would be helpful, perhaps the scrutiny chairs at some point to sit with the officers that are working on the corporate plan, because what we're trying to say is where we're judging against what's in the corporate plan. So where it says a policy has developed, but the progress is judged as good, but actually for us it says improvement is becoming evident. That's what is the measure of progressing well. So we are saying that I think on a number of areas, it's very difficult to see how the evidence provided to us stacks up with the defined outcome or progress award that's been given. And therefore, I think that's something that we should reflect back to the Cabinet members. Thank you.
Councillor Louise Brown, very briefly.
Yeah, I think it's also about what's missing under these headings and what's actually included in it. I pointed out that there are various headings there, like Best Start in Life, which was supposed to apply to all children, and to make sure that it actually does. But I mean, obviously, that's part and parcel of the development of the actual objectives in their self, and really then it's a question of how much of a role scrutiny can have in terms of putting any wording within those objectives, because in some senses, how effective can scrutiny be if we don't have any input into what comes under the heading of these corporate goals and the content of them. And I think, in a sense, what active scrutiny role can we play as a result of that limitation, really? Thank you.
Councillor Brown, thanks for that. I'd like to express my thanks to Richard Jones today for taking us through the corporate plan, and to Will McLean and Richard John for coming in for this particular aspect. But to all the other officers today. It's been a long but very interesting meeting, and I think it's been worthwhile in terms of the two elements today. And obviously we've had a joint effort here with Francis and myself. So obviously thank members today for all of your inputs and your patience through the meeting. Thank you for attending, and I hope you have a safe journey home. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.